15:32 on a night in Worcester, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1933, and a man named Hudson Hoagland is sitting on the edge of his bed, watching his wife shiver under a pile of blankets. She has the flu. A bad one. Her fever has been climbing for hours, and now she says something strange. She tells him he's been gone a long time. He hasn't gone anywhere. He's been sitting right there, a few feet from her, the whole evening. He tells her that. She doesn't believe him. To her, whole stretches of the last hour feel like they have gone missing, like someone spooled the tape forward without her. Most husbands would just say something soothing and leave it there. Hoagland doesn't. Hoagland is a scientist. And something about the way she says it, not confused, not delirious, just certain that time has been behaving strangely around her, makes him go get a stopwatch instead. He sits back down next to her. He asks her to do something simple. Count to 60. Try to do it at what feels like a rate of 1 number per second. Nothing complicated. Just count, the way you'd count seconds in your head waiting for something. She starts. He watches the stopwatch, not her face. She finishes counting to 60. He looks down at the watch. Real time elapsed, nowhere close to 60 seconds. Her internal count, her felt sense of 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, has been racing ahead of the clock on the nightstand. As her fever climbs over the following hours, he does it again, and each time the gap widens. The hotter she runs, the faster her internal count gallops past real time. Then, as the fever breaks and her temperature comes back down, something even stranger happens. Her counting slows back down. It comes back toward normal, in step with her temperature, like there's a dial somewhere inside her that the fever had been quietly turning. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's easy to let it slide past as a cute historical anecdote and miss what it's actually claiming. It is not claiming that his wife was confused about how much time had passed. Confusion would be if she guessed wrong. This is different. This is her internal clock, the thing inside her that ticks off seconds the way a stopwatch does, running at a different speed than the clock on the wall. Not because she was distracted, not because she was frightened, because her body was hotter. That's the moment this whole video is going to keep circling back to. A sick woman in a Massachusetts bedroom in 1933, counting numbers out loud while her husband stares at a stopwatch, becomes the first hard evidence that the thing you call time, the thing you feel ticking behind your eyes every waking moment of your life, is not some fixed, universal metronome your brain is passively reading. It's manufactured, it's biological, and it can be sped up, slowed down, distorted, sometimes by nothing more exotic than a fever, which raises the question that actually brought you here. Because you didn't click on this to hear about a 100-year-old flu. You clicked on this because you felt it yourself, the way a summer used to last forever when you were 11, and now whole years seem to fold up and disappear before you've even settled into them. You've probably said it out loud to someone. Time is going faster, as if it's a fact about the world, like the seasons changing. Here's the first thing I need you to sit with, because it's going to matter later, and I'm not going to explain it yet. Whatever is happening to you when a year collapses into what feels like a season, it is not the same thing that happened to Hoagland's wife. Something else is going on, something that has to do with what your brain chooses to keep and what it quietly throws away. And there's an experiment later involving a 100-foot drop, a piece of equipment strapped to a man's wrist, and a claim so counterintuitive that when I first read it, I had to put the book down and just stare at the wall for a minute, because it means that the slow-motion car crash, the story everyone tells about time stretching out in a moment of terror, might be a lie your memory tells you after the fact. But we're not there yet. First, you need to understand that there isn't one clock running in your head. There are at least two. And the unsettling part, the part that this video is really about, is that those two clocks don't agree with each other. They can't. They're built from completely different material. One of them is running right now, as you listen to this sentence. The other one won't finish its verdict on today until tonight, or next week, or 20 years from now, when you try to remember what today was like and find out how much of it actually got saved. The book that sent me down this rabbit hole is called Time Warped. by a woman named Claudia Hammond, a British broadcaster and psychology lecturer who spent years pulling together the actual research on how humans perceive time, as opposed to the folk wisdom everyone repeats about it. I want to be honest about how I came to this book. I went in expecting a fairly tidy answer. Something like, your brain processes fewer new events as you age, so time feels faster. End of story. Roll credits. I did not expect the answer to fracture into two separate, only loosely related phenomena, one of which barely survives contact with actual data, and I did not expect a piece of 1930s fever research to end up being one of the most solid, load-bearing pieces of evidence in the entire story. I came out of that book unable to unthink the difference between the two clocks. I think by the end of this, you will too. So let's build this properly, from the ground up, the way the researchers actually built it, because if you skip to the end, you'll just get another vague self-help platitude about living in the moment, and that's not what this is. This is stranger and colder than that. Let's start with the clock inside Hoagland's wife, because it turns out that clock is still there, in you, right now, and it's more fragile than you think. Picture the room again for a second. It's 1933. No digital thermometers with a beep and a screen. A mercury thermometer, glass held under the tongue. No smartphone stopwatch. An actual mechanical stopwatch, the kind with a stem you press, a sweeping second hand behind glass. Hoagland is not a random panicked husband. He's a physiologist, someone whose job is to look at the body as a machine with dials and rates and outputs. And something in him refuses to let his wife's odd complaint just evaporate into, she's delirious, poor thing. He treats it as data. So he sets up something almost embarrassingly simple. He asks her to count from 1 to 60, trying to pace herself at 1 number per second. No clock in front of her, nothing to check herself against, just her internal sense of a second, the same internal sense you use when you're waiting for a microwave to finish, and you find yourself mouthing along in your head. And he times her against the stopwatch, not telling her the result. The first time, with her fever running high, she reaches 60 in a stretch of real time that is meaningfully shorter than 60 seconds. Accounts of the exact number vary, but the shape of the finding is the same across the versions. She is counting fast, subjectively pacing out what feels like 1-second gaps, but doing it at a rate that beats the clock, which means, from the inside, her sense of 1 second has gotten shorter. Her internal ticking has sped up. To keep pace with her own speeded-up sense of a second, she has to say the numbers faster than the actual world is turning. He tries it again later, fever still high. Same pattern, maybe even more pronounced. Then, over the following hours, as whatever infection she's fighting starts to lose its grip and her temperature drifts back down toward normal, he tries it again, and her counting slows. It comes back toward matching the actual stopwatch. As her body cools, her internal clock, whatever it is, however it works, comes back into agreement with the world. Now, stop and actually picture what that means, because it's very easy to hear her sense of time sped up and let it stay abstract. It means that somewhere in her nervous system there is something that behaves like a metronome, something with a tempo. And that tempo isn't fixed. It isn't hardwired the way the length of a foot or the size of a heart is fixed. It's adjustable in real time by a completely unrelated physical variable, heat. Turn up the temperature and the internal metronome ticks faster, so more of these fast internal ticks pass during any given stretch of real-world time, so a real minute feels like it contains more than 60 of her internal seconds, meaning it feels like more than a minute has gone by. Turn the temperature back down and the metronome slows, and the illusion fades. I want to give you an image for this because internal metronome is still a little abstract. And this channel doesn't do abstract without something to hang it on. Think of an engine, not a car engine, something simpler, like an old furnace with a gauge on it. When the furnace is cold, the needle ticks along slow and steady. Heat that furnace up, push more energy through it, and everything inside starts moving faster. The fan spins quicker, the pilot flickers faster, the whole machine's internal rhythm speeds up, even though the clock on the wall next to it hasn't changed its pace at all. Hoagland's finding, formally published a few years later, is the idea of a chemical clock, the notion that your sense of duration is generated by ongoing chemical, metabolic processes in the body, and that speeding up those processes, the way a fever does, speeds up the clock itself, is exactly that furnace. Your body is the furnace. Heat it, and the ticking speeds up. The world outside doesn't change pace, only the ticking does. Here's the part I want you to actually feel, not just understand intellectually. This means the second you are experiencing right now, while you listen to my voice, is not a fixed universal unit being fed into your brain from outside. It's being generated, manufactured continuously by biological machinery running at whatever pace your current physiological state happens to set. Which means the pace of your consciousness, the tempo at which your own now ticks by, has been quietly adjustable by fever, by temperature, potentially by other physiological states nobody in 1933 was equipped to fully test, this whole time, without you ever noticing it happen, because the only tool you have for checking your internal clock's pace is that same internal clock. There's no external reference point installed in your skull. You are the furnace, and you are also the only person reading your own gauge. Hold on to that. Hold on to Hoagland's fever clock as one entire self-contained piece of this puzzle, because I'm about to tell you it is almost completely irrelevant to the question you actually came here with, the question of why your whole life seems to be speeding up as you age. And that disconnect, the fact that these two things feel like they should be the same phenomenon and are not, is the first crack in the floor. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when they trot out, time feels faster as you get older, as if it's settled science. Somebody actually went and checked. Properly. Not with anecdotes, not with a comment section full of people going, so true, but with a real survey, methodologically serious, aimed squarely at finding out whether the folk belief holds up. In 2005, two researchers in Munich, Mark Wittmann and Sandra Lehnhoff, went out and surveyed 499 people. Not a handful of undergraduates in a psychology building, which is the usual sample in this kind of research. An honest spread, ages 14 all the way up to 94. They asked people across that whole range how fast time seemed to be passing for them across a whole range of different time frames. Does the last week feel fast or slow, the last month, the last year, the last decade? I want to be straight with you about what they found, because this is the part of the story where a lesser video would just confirm what you already believe and move on, and I'd rather slow down and actually be honest with you, because that honesty is the entire reason to trust anything else I tell you in the next hour. They found that yes, there is a real effect. Older people on average really do report that time feels like it's speeding up more than younger people report. That part of the folk wisdom is not a myth. But, and this is the part that almost never makes it into the pop science version of this story, the effect is small. Small to moderate. In their statistical model, age differences account for, at most, something in the neighborhood of 10% of the variation in how fast people say time feels. 10%, which means roughly 90% of why one person feels like time is flying and another person, the same age, doesn't, has nothing to do with how old they are at all. And there's a second wrinkle, one I actually find more interesting than the headline number. The age effect isn't uniform across every kind of time frame. Ask people about the last week or the last month. A 14-year-old and a 94-year-old answer in roughly the same way. Weeks and months feel like they pass at similar speeds no matter how old you are. The gap only opens up when you ask about something as long as a decade. Ask someone in their 80s how the last 10 years went compared to someone in their 20s, and that's where the difference shows up. Ask about last Tuesday, and age barely predicts the answer at all. Sit with that for a second because it's doing real work. If getting older simply cranked some universal dial that made time subjectively faster across the board, the way turning up Hoagland's furnace sped up his wife's second-by-second sense of duration, you'd expect the effect to show up everywhere, in the weeks, in the months, in the years, in the decades, all speeding up together, proportionally, the same mechanism just scaled up. That is not what the data shows. The effect is concentrated almost entirely in the long view, how a whole decade feels looking back, and nearly absent in the short view, how a week feels while you're in it, which tells you something important, something I want you to file away because we're going to need it in a few minutes. Whatever is making your decades feel shorter as you age is probably not the same mechanism as whatever made Hoagland's wife count too fast during a fever. A fever changes your felt sense of a second while you're inside that second. The aging effect barely touches your felt sense of a second or a week at all. It only shows up when you try to size up a decade after the fact. One of these is a clock you're reading in the moment. The other is a judgment you're making in hindsight, using completely different evidence. That distinction, clock in the moment versus judgment in hindsight, is going to become the spine of everything else in this video, so I want to give it a name before we go further, the way the actual researchers do. They call the first one prospective timing, the sense of duration while an interval is unfolding. How long does this meeting feel while you're sitting in it? And they call the second one retrospective timing, the sense of duration after the fact. How long did that meeting feel once you look back on it days or years later? Say those two words in your head once, perspective, retrospective, and then mostly forget the jargon and just remember the plain version. The clock you're inside of right now versus the story you tell afterward about how much time that was. Hoagland's fever experiment was entirely about the first kind, the clock you're inside of. Wittmann and Lainhoff's decade finding is hinting, without quite proving it yet, that the aging effect lives mostly in the second kind, the story you tell afterward. And if that's true, then the phrase "time is speeding up" is doing something sneaky. It's borrowing the language of a ticking clock, of Hoagland's furnace, something running hot, something you feel accelerate while you're inside the feeling, to describe something that might not be about the ticking at all. It might be about the story, about what gets kept and what gets thrown away when you try to look back. I promised you a piece of evidence that would make that split undeniable, not just suggested by a survey's statistical shape, but proven directly in a single elegant experiment. It involves a tower, 100 feet of open air, and a man falling through it on purpose, wearing a piece of equipment on his wrist that was never designed to be readable by a human eye, moving at normal speed. I'm going to make you wait for that one a little longer, the way it deserves. Because before you can appreciate what that fall proves, you need to understand where the story your memory tells actually comes from, how it gets written in the first place, back when you were young enough that everything was still new. So let's go back to the part of your life that, statistically, is doing an enormous amount of quiet, invisible work on your sense of your whole existence right now, tonight, while you're doing something as ordinary as listening to this. Think about the years between roughly 15 and 28. Not a precise window. Nobody's claiming your internal calendar has hard edges, but somewhere in that stretch, for most people. Now think about how disproportionately much of your identity, if you actually audit it, seems to have been assembled right there. First real heartbreak. First time you drove somewhere alone and felt like a different kind of person for it. The music that still, embarrassingly, feels like the music, no matter what's actually good now. The friend group that still shows up in your dreams even though you haven't spoken in a decade. Ask most people over 40 to just start listing memories, no prompting, no theme, and hold up a mirror to what comes back, and you'll find it's wildly overrepresented by that same narrow stretch of years, out of an entire lifetime of years to choose from. This isn't a coincidence. And it isn't just nostalgia being sentimental. Researchers went looking for exactly this pattern directly, asking people across a full range of ages to freely recall autobiographical memories, then plotting where those memories cluster across the person's life. And what falls out of that data, again and again, replicated across more than 50 separate studies since, is a bump. A hump in the graph, right over adolescence and early adulthood, where the density of retrievable memories spikes far above what you'd expect if memory were evenly spread across a life. Researchers call it the reminiscence bump. It's not that older adults invented more memories from that period. It's that when you go digging for anything, disproportionately, that's where the shovel keeps hitting something. Why there, of all places? The honest answer, And I want to flag clearly that this next part is interpretation, not a settled mechanism anyone has proven with the same clarity as the bump itself. Is that this stretch of life is unusually saturated with things that are happening to you for the first time, and unusually saturated with events that define who you are, as opposed to just things that happen. Leaving home for the first time. Choosing, for maybe the first time in your life, who you actually want to be around. Your body changing into whatever shape it was going to settle into. Falling in love or failing to in a way that actually costs something. A brain that is busy constructing an identity is going to lay down memory the way a diary gets written most furiously by someone who's just discovered they have something worth writing down. Here's an image that's going to matter for the rest of this video, so hold on to it. Imagine your memory isn't a video camera running continuously, recording everything at the same fidelity, minute after minute, for your entire life. Imagine it's more like a GPS device that only drops a waypoint when you make a turn. Drive straight down a long, featureless highway, nothing changes, no decisions to make, no new scenery, and the device might log almost nothing for an hour. Take a series of sharp turns through an unfamiliar city, and it drops a waypoint every few seconds. Now, months later, someone hands you that GPS log and asks you to judge how long each stretch of driving took purely from the log. The empty highway, even though it consumed just as much real time as the winding city streets, will look, on paper, like it barely happened. Because nothing was recorded. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing there triggered a waypoint. That's the mechanism the researchers point to for the reminiscence bump, and it's the same mechanism, I'd argue, sitting underneath the entire time is speeding up complaint, just scaled from years down to the texture of ordinary weeks. Your teenage years and early 20s were a city full of turns, firsts, identity-defining moments, things your brain, quite reasonably, flagged as worth keeping in detail. Later adulthood, for most people, becomes something closer to that long, straight highway, not because nothing happens, but because so much of what happens is a repeat of something that already happened last year and the year before that. Commute, groceries, the same rooms, the same faces, the same weekly shape recurring so reliably that your brain, doing the sensible thing a filing system does, stops bothering to flag most of it as distinct. And when you, years from now, are asked to look back at the last decade and judge how much time it felt like, the way Wittman and Lenhoff's survey respondents were asked, you're not actually consulting some internal stopwatch that ran continuously and recorded the true duration. You don't have one of those for retrospective judgments. What you're doing, whether you realize it or not, is opening the GPS log, counting waypoints, and a decade with few waypoints, however genuinely long you live through it hour by hour, comes back thin. Compressed, fast in memory, even though every single day of it took exactly 24 hours to happen, the same as every day of your bump years did. I want to pause here and make sure this lands the way it should, because it's easy to hear your brain compresses routine as a fairly dry piece of cognitive science and miss the actual personal, slightly vertiginous implication sitting underneath it. It means the years of your life you can least afford to lose. The years happening to you right now, tonight, this ordinary Tuesday you almost didn't bother remembering the details of, are, by default, the years your future self's internal accounting system is most likely to write off as barely happened. Not because they mattered less while you were living them, because nothing about them told your memory system to keep a copy. Right now, whatever you're doing after this video ends, whatever ordinary thing is next on your list tonight, some part of your nervous system is already making a decision about it, a decision you have no direct access to and no vote in. Is this worth a waypoint, or is this highway? And you will only find out which one it decided years from now when you try to reach back for today and discover either something vivid waiting there, or nothing at all. Now, I told you earlier that Claudia Hammond had a name for something related to this, something she calls the holiday paradox, and I think this is exactly the right moment to bring it in, because it's going to do something the reminiscence bump alone can't. It's going to show you that these two clocks, the in-the-moment one and the afterward one, don't just run at different speeds, they can run in completely opposite directions on the very same stretch of time. Here's the paradox. and you have almost certainly lived it yourself without ever naming it. You go somewhere new for a week. A different city, a different country, doesn't matter. Somewhere unfamiliar enough that every meal is a decision, every street is unmapped in your head, every hour is asking something of your attention that your normal routine never asks. While you're there, in the thick of it, days can feel like they're dragging. So much is happening, so much needs deciding that a single afternoon can feel unusually long, almost tiring in how much it's asking of you. That's the in-the-moment clock, and it's running slow, stretched by how much attention every hour demands. Then, you come home. And a strange thing happens to that same week, once you look back on it. It swells. It feels, in retrospect, like it must have been 2 weeks, 3, far longer than the string of identical, forgettable weeks sitting on either side of it in your calendar. The week that dragged while you were living it becomes the week that feels enormous once you're remembering it. Now flip it. Think of some stretch of ordinary time, a run of routine weeks at work, say, nothing eventful, the same commute, the same desk, the same lunch. While you're in it, it can feel like it's crawling. Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks deep into nothing happening, can feel like the longest afternoon of your life. That's the in-the-moment clock again, this time dragging because boredom, it turns out, also stretches the felt duration of a moment. An understaffed hour with nothing to do can feel every bit as long, minute to minute, as a demanding one. But ask yourself, months later, how that whole run of weeks felt, looking back, and it's gone, compressed to almost nothing. A blur you can't even separate into individual days. The stretch that dragged while you lived it becomes the stretch that vanishes once you're remembering it. Do you see what just happened? The novel week and the boring stretch can both feel slow while you're inside them. Attention heavy for opposite reasons, new information in one case, sheer tedium in the other. But when you turn around and look back, they go in completely opposite directions. The novel week gets bigger in memory. The boring stretch gets smaller. Same in the moment sensation, both dragged, and yet the two retrospective verdicts are exact opposites. That's the paradox, and it's Hammond's own term for it, her synthesis, stitching together exactly the split we've been building this whole video around. The clock you're inside of and the story you tell afterward aren't just running at different speeds. They can be actively pulling against each other on the same week for entirely different reasons. The moment-to-moment clock cares about attentional load, about how much processing a given stretch is demanding of you right now. The afterward clock doesn't care about that at all. It cares about waypoints, about how much got written down for later retrieval. And attention-heavy boredom writes down almost nothing, no matter how slowly it crawled while you were suffering through it. I want to give you one more image, because I think this deserves its own picture, distinct from the GPS one, since it's really showing you something the GPS metaphor doesn't quite capture. The two clocks pulling apart, not just one clock being sparse. Picture 2 snow globes. Shake the first one, the holiday week, and everything inside gets suspended in the water, every flake distinct, catching light, taking its time to settle, because there's so much in there to hold up the fall. Shake the second one, 3 routine weeks at your desk, and there's almost nothing inside to suspend. A few flakes drift straight down, and it's still again almost instantly. Both globes, held in your hand right now, take the same second to shake. But looked at later, one is still full of visible, floating detail, and the other has already gone empty and clear. That's the difference between living through a stretch of time and remembering it. And it means something slightly cruel if you actually let yourself feel it. The parts of your life that felt hardest to get through in the moment, the demanding, overstimulating, unfamiliar weeks, are frequently the parts that come back the richest, the fullest, the most real in memory. And the parts that felt like nothing while you endured them are the parts memory will hand you back as nothing, forever. Your felt suffering in the moment and your felt richness in memory are not even measuring the same thing. Which brings us finally to the fall. In 2007, a group of researchers led by a scientist named David Eagleman set out to test something that almost everyone believes without ever questioning it, that in moments of real terror, time slows down. You've heard the stories. the car that starts to skid, and suddenly the driver has all the time in the world to consider their options. The mugging, the accident, the near miss. Described afterward in that same language, everything went slow motion. It's such a common description of trauma that it's practically a genre convention. Eagleman and his colleagues, Ches Stetson and Matthew Fiesta, wanted to know, is that literally true? In the moment of terror, does the brain actually speed up its processing, take in more frames per second, the way a camera can be switched to high-speed capture? Or is something else going on? To test it, they needed a way to genuinely frighten people in a lab, safely, repeatably, which is a harder problem than it sounds. Their solution was a tower, a device called a SCAD, a suspended catch-air device, essentially a controlled freefall rig. Volunteers are hoisted up, then released, and they fall backward, arms out, into a net 31 meters below, roughly 100 feet, about 10 stories, more than enough to trigger a real involuntary jolt of fear in almost anyone, even knowing intellectually that the net is there and the equipment is safe. The fall itself lasts 2.5 seconds. Not long. Long enough. Here's the clever part, the part that turns this from a scary stunt into an actual instrument. Each volunteer wore a small device on their wrist. They called it a perceptual chronometer, a screen that flickered numbers at a rate calibrated to sit right at the edge of normal human perception. Under everyday conditions, watching that device on the ground, standing still, the numbers flash too fast to read. They're just a flicker, noise, meaningless. But if it were true, if terror really does speed up your perceptual processing, the way a high-speed camera captures more frames per second, then, during the fall, with the fear response fully online, subjects should suddenly be able to read those flickering numbers. Time, from the inside, would be running slow enough, relative to the device, that the flicker would resolve into legible digits. The chronometer was, in effect, a direct physical test of Hoagland's furnace, applied not to fever, but to fear. If terror speeds up the internal clock the way heat did, the flicker should become readable. They ran the experiment. Person after person went up the tower, fell the 100 feet, hit the net, breathing hard, adrenaline spiking, by every honest measure, genuinely afraid. And afterward, they were asked, could you read the numbers? No one could, not reliably, not more than they could on the ground. The chronometer, calibrated exactly at the edge of ordinary perceptual resolution, stayed just as illegible during the plummet as it was standing still. Which means, directly, physically, with no ambiguity in the measurement, their moment-to-moment perceptual processing did not speed up. They were not taking in more frames per second. Whatever was happening to them during those 2.5 seconds of real terror, it was not Hoagland's furnace turning up. The perspective clock, the one running in the moment, did not budge. And then came the part that made me put the book down. After the fall, once they were back on solid ground, safe, unhurt, researchers asked each volunteer to estimate how long their own fall had lasted. And separately, before ever going up the tower, they'd asked each person to watch someone else fall and estimate how long that looked like it took, to get a baseline sense of what 2.5 seconds looks like from the outside. The gap between those two numbers is the whole finding. On average, people who had just fallen themselves retrospectively estimated their own fall took about 36% longer than it actually did, recalling something closer to 3 seconds for a fall that took 2.5. Not because they experienced it slower while it was happening. The chronometer had already ruled that out, cleanly, in the moment. The extra length was added afterward, in the remembering. Say that back to yourself slowly, because it's the entire architecture of this video compressed into a single 100-foot drop. Time did not slow down. Memory thickened. The fall itself, moment to moment, ran at completely ordinary speed. No bonus frames, no expanded now. But because it was terrifying, because it was novel, because a genuinely frightened brain lays down memory the way a novel, identity-defining week does, the encoding was denser than normal for those 2.5 seconds. And when that dense little packet of memory is examined afterward, unpacked, replayed, it reads back as longer than it was. The same way a 5-day trip abroad reads back as fuller and bigger than 5 identical days at your desk. even though every one of those days lived took exactly 24 hours. Here's the image I keep coming back to for this one, and it's not the GPS, and it's not the snow globe. This one's about photography. Imagine the fall wasn't filmed in slow motion at all. It was filmed at completely normal speed, the whole 2.5 seconds captured with an ordinary camera, running at an ordinary rate. But afterward, someone sat down and developed every single frame, printed each one, examined it, filed it away individually, instead of just glancing at the real ones and moving on the way you would with an unremarkable afternoon. The film wasn't shot in slow motion. It was overdeveloped afterward. That's what a frightening 2.5 seconds does to your brain, not a slower shutter speed. A dark room working overtime once the danger's already passed. This is the cleanest, most direct proof that the two clocks are actually separate systems, not just two ways of describing one thing. The free fall study isolates them from each other in a single controlled event. Same 2.5 seconds tested twice, once with an instrument reading the in-the-moment experience directly, and once with a question reading the after-the-fact judgment, and the two readings disagree. In the moment, ordinary, in memory, stretched by more than a third. If there were only one clock in you, that couldn't happen. You'd get the same answer twice. You don't. Which means somewhere in your skull, there really are two separate systems doing two separate jobs, and this fall is the proof, not just the metaphor. I want you to notice something slightly disturbing hiding in that 36%, something beyond the neuroscience. It means that every time slowed down story you've ever heard, every account of a car crash, a fight, a fall, described in that reverent slow motion language, is very likely describing a real, honest experience of the aftermath and a false description of the event itself. The person isn't lying. Their memory of the fall genuinely is longer, richer, more detailed than an ordinary 2.5 seconds. But the extra length was manufactured afterward by the encoding not experienced during the fall by some heightened, dilated form of consciousness. The slow-motion crash is real as a memory. It was never real as an experience. And there is, as far as this research shows, no way for the person it happened to tell the difference from the inside. The memory feels exactly as authoritative as a live experience would have felt. That's not a flaw in their honesty. It's a flaw, if you want to call it that, built into how memory works for everyone, including you. Now hold that finding up next to the reminiscence bump and next to the holiday paradox, because I want you to see that they're not three separate ideas. They're the same idea tested three different ways at three different scales. A 100-foot fall lasting 2.5 seconds, a week-long holiday, a 10-year stretch of adulthood, different sizes, same mechanism over and over. Retrospective duration is not a readout of how long something actually took. It's a reconstruction, assembled afterward from how much got stored, and how much got stored depends on how novel, how demanding, how identity relevant the interval was while it was happening. Not on how many literal seconds the clock on the wall ticked through, which means the honest answer to why does time go faster as I get older starts to come into focus, and it is not the answer most people expect. It is not that some biological process inside you is directly speeding up your perception of time as you age, the way Hoagland's fever sped up his wife's internal count. There's very little evidence for that story holding up at the scale of years and decades. Remember, Wittmann and Lenhoff found the age effect barely touches how a week or a month feels, which is exactly where you'd expect a Hoagland-style furnace effect to show up if it were driving this. The honest answer is closer to something quieter, and in some ways lonelier. Adulthood, for most people, is structurally low on waypoints, fewer firsts, more repetition, the same rooms recurring, and a life increasingly built out of repetition is a life your own memory system is, by design, going to file away thin, not because it mattered less, but because nothing about it triggered the machinery that writes things down in detail. Before we go further, I want to give the other side of this its full, fair hearing, because there is a genuinely serious, contested scientific attempt to argue that something more like Hoagland's furnace really is involved in the aging story too, not just the memory side of things. And I don't want to wave it away just because it complicates a tidy answer. In 2019, a physicist named Adrian Bejan published a proposal that tries to locate part of the aging effect not in memory at all, but back in perspective moment-to-moment processing, the same territory Hoagland's furnace lived in. Bejan's idea centers on something called a saccade, a small, fast, largely involuntary flick of the eyes between one point of fixation and the next. Your eyes are making dozens of these every minute right now, whether you notice it or not, as you scan a scene or a face or a screen. Bejan's proposal is that as the body ages, the pathway signals travel along inside the nervous system physically lengthen and slow, which in turn slows the rate at which these saccades happen. Meaning an older brain samples the world in fewer discrete visual frames per second than a younger one did. Fewer frames processed per actual clock second on his account would make that same clock second feel like it contains less, feel shorter, thinner, faster to pass, purely as a function of processing rate, independent of memory or novelty at all. I want to be very precise about how to hold this idea, because it's the kind of claim that sounds authoritative, a physicist, a named mechanism, a plausible-sounding chain of reasoning, and it would be easy to hand it more certainty than it's earned. This is not a theory that time perception researchers have converged on. It is one proposal from one scientist still being actively discussed and debated in recent popular coverage, sitting alongside the memory density account rather than having replaced it or been confirmed against it. Nobody in this research has isolated a single winning mechanism, not the chemical clock, not memory density, not Bejan's saccade proposal, as the definitive explanation for the aging effect. They may all be capturing a piece of something real. None of them has been shown to be the primary driver. That's not a failure of the science. It's just where the science honestly is, a century after Hoagland's stopwatch, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend there's a tidier ending waiting for you. There's an older idea too, one that predates almost everything else in this story by more than 100 years, and it's worth understanding precisely because it's so seductive and so easy to overstate. In 1877, a French philosopher named Paul Janet, his idea comes down to us mainly through the philosopher and psychologist William James, who described it in his own work, proposed something almost embarrassingly simple, purely arithmetic. A single year, Janet pointed out, is a fixed slice of your life so far. At age 5, 1 year is a fifth of your entire conscious existence, enormous proportionally. At age 50, that same 12 months is 1/50th of everything you've lived. The year itself hasn't changed size, but the fraction it represents, out of the whole of everything you are, keeps shrinking every single year for the rest of your life. Picture a fraction with a numerator that never changes, 1 year, always just 1 year, sitting on top of a denominator that keeps growing, 1, 5, 20, 50. The top stays the same size forever. The bottom keeps swelling, and so the value of that fraction, the proportional weight of any given year, keeps shrinking quietly for as long as you're alive to keep dividing. It's elegant. It's also, and I want to be direct about this, not a proven mechanism of the brain. It's a philosophical observation about ratios, not an empirical finding about neurons or memory or attention. It shows you a reason equal durations might feel unequal, a purely mathematical reason, no biology required, but it doesn't prove your brain actually computes anything like this fraction, and it says nothing about why a decade shows the aging effect while a week doesn't, the way Wittmann and Leinhoff's actual data does. Nearly a century later, in 1975, a researcher named Robert Lemlich tried to push Janet's proportional idea further, proposing that subjective duration might scale not linearly with your age, but with the square root of it, a more conservative curve, tested against people's own retrospective reports. And here, I need to flag something directly, because it's exactly the kind of thing that spreads without anyone checking the original source. You may have encountered the claim, somewhere online, that this kind of model puts the subjective midpoint of your entire life at around age 18 or 20, the age by which, mathematically, half your felt life is already behind you. That specific number is not something Lemlich's actual 1975 paper states. It's a calculation people have run afterward, using this general style of ratio model, and it's been repeated widely enough that it now gets attributed back to him as if he said it. He didn't, not in his published work. It's worth knowing that number exists and worth knowing exactly how shaky its provenance is. Now, with the fever clock and the free-fall chronometer and the reminiscence bump and the holiday paradox and Janet's shrinking fraction all sitting in front of you, I want to put two entire fields of research directly against each other, because this is the part that genuinely unsettled me when I first saw it laid out plainly, and I don't think it's usually said out loud this bluntly. Memory research, the reminiscence bump, the density account, everything Rubin and the researchers who followed him found, says that duration, looking backward, is a function of how much got stored. More encoding, longer the interval feels afterward, full stop. Attention research, Wittmann and Lainhoff's survey, the felt drag of a demanding new place or a tedious empty afternoon, says that duration, while you're inside it, is a function of how much your attention is currently being asked to do, completely independent of what gets kept for later. And here's the collision. These two systems very often point in exactly opposite directions on the very same stretch of time. The novel week that drags miserably while you're living it becomes the week memory inflates. The tedious month that also drags while you're living it becomes the month memory erases almost entirely. Two systems measuring the same interval, and instead of confirming each other, they cancel each other out on a semi-regular basis in your own life without you ever noticing the disagreement, because you never get to check both readings side by side. You only ever get the one you happen to be consulting. How does this feel right now? Or how did that feel, looking back? Never both, never at once, never reconciled. Which means your two internal clocks are not partners. They're closer to adversaries, two separate systems built for two separate jobs that happen to share your skull and rarely agree, and you are left always holding only whichever one is currently answering the question. And when you try to take stock of your whole life, when you lie awake and ask yourself where the last 10 years went, you are not consulting some neutral aggregate record of your true lived duration. You have no access to that. You never did. You are consulting the memory clock, and only the memory clock, because the moment-to-moment clock doesn't keep records. It only reports on the instant it's currently occupying, and then it's gone, replaced by the next instant, forever. The memory clock is the only one of the two that persists long enough to be asked a question like, "How has my life gone?" Which means the entire feeling of your life speeding up is being generated by exactly one of your two internal instruments, the one built out of storage and novelty and waypoints. And you have no way to cross-check its verdict against anything more objective, because nothing more objective was ever recording. I keep circling back to this thought, so let me say it plainly, because I think it's the sharpest version of the idea underneath everything so far tonight. You cannot trust your own sense of how much of your life is left or how fast it's going, because the only instrument you have for measuring it is the same organ that is, itself, gradually running out of things to notice. Think about what that actually means for a moment, sitting where you are right now, tonight. The version of you listening to this sentence at this exact second is, whether you feel it happening or not, already deciding something. Somewhere underneath conscious awareness, your nervous system is assessing this evening, this ordinary stretch of time you're spending, doing something as unremarkable as watching a video, and it is quietly filing today into one of two folders: routine, forgettable, a straight stretch of highway with nothing worth a waypoint, or something worth keeping, something that years from now, when older, you goes looking for evidence of what this era of your life felt like, will actually be there to find. You don't get a vote in real time. You'll only find out which folder tonight landed in the way you find out about anything in that second folder, by trying to remember it later and discovering either something waiting there or nothing. And here's the part that turns this from an interesting piece of psychology into something closer to a genuine unease if you let it sit long enough. If retrospective time really is built out of density of memory rather than clock seconds, then a life spent chasing comfort, chasing the smooth and the familiar and the predictable, The very things most adults spend their 30s, 40s, 50s actively engineering for themselves, a settled routine, a known commute, a reliable rhythm, is, by the exact mechanism this whole video has been building, a life quietly engineering its own compression. The more successfully you build a stable, low-friction, well-optimized existence, the fewer waypoints your own memory system will have any reason to lay down, and the faster that stretch of your life will read back to you decades from now as having barely happened at all. Comfort and forgettability, on this account, are not opposites. They're the same mechanism, wearing two different names. I don't think that means comfort is a mistake. I think it means comfort has a cost nobody bills you for at the time it's purchased. You pay it later, in the currency of how much of your own life you're able to find when you go looking for it. I want to go back one last time, to that bedroom in Worcester in 1933. A man sitting beside his feverish wife, stopwatch in hand, refusing to let a strange thing she said just slip past as nothing. That's really the whole shape of what I've been asking you to do for the last hour. Not to fix the feeling that time is speeding up, not even to slow it down, just to stop letting it slip past as nothing, to sit with it the way Hoagland sat with her and actually look. Her fever broke. Her counting came back to normal. That part of the story has an ending. Yours doesn't, not yet. And I don't have one to hand you. Nobody does. There's still no single organ, no one circuit, no unifying answer for why a decade folds up small in memory while a week won't sit still. A century of researchers, and the field still argues over whether the truer culprit is chemical or memory or something structural in how the eyes themselves move. Nobody has settled it. I'm not going to pretend I can settle it for you here. What I can tell you is the only honest, actionable thing in all of this. Seek out the unfamiliar, and the years will feel longer when you look back on them. That's real. It's also not a fix. It doesn't add a single second to your life. It just changes how full the record looks when you go searching it. Because growing older is, by definition, the slow work of running out of firsts. And every year you get better at comfort is a year you get quietly better at disappearing from your own memory. So tonight, whatever's left of it is being decided right now without asking you. Filed as a blur or filed as a landmark. You won't find out which until you go looking for it. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 20 years from now, reaching back for tonight and discovering one way or the other whether anyone was keeping the record.